Hello, inmates, and welcome to the cellblock Scorch Week 12. This is Bones, and I'm recording as the winner of this week's Scorch. This week's prompt was given by Cricket. I'm gonna give you some stats before I tell you what it is. Ready? So, I was analyzing the Scorches I've written a few weeks ago, and I decided to assign them all genres to see what I write the most. And, guys, more than half of my Scorches are comedy. Like, I'm reading through and I'm like, comedy, 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 comedy forever. But every once in a while, it's interrupted jarringly by bouts of, what the hell did I just read type horror and tear your heart out drama. And well, welcome to my first descent into insanity. There are two things that are true about this Scorch. First, to this day, I consider it one of the best Scorches I've written. Second, everyone hates it. Even if they like it, which lots of people also like it, they hate it. But I think, once I tell you the prompt, you'll all agree that it's a little like that "who could have done this" meme. So, Cricket gave me the prompt. Do you know how much better off I would be if I had never met you? And then, I wrote this. The title of this Scorch is Falling. She could still remember it, the first day she fell. Falling was a blessing, people always said. A special, beautiful part of human biology that was yet unexplained. So few people ever experienced it, that rush when you see the one you're destined to be with. Soulmates are rare, after all, even though everyone supposedly has one. Less than 10% of the population ever meet theirs. But if two do happen to be near each other, all it takes to trigger the fall is a single nanosecond of eye contact. Of late, people were calling the fall falling in love. It was more romantic, they said. It certainly did sound that way, if one wasn't paying attention. But in love or not, falling was falling. Where you fall doesn't get rid of the nausea, or the vertigo, or the general discomfort of knowing you are being pulled somewhere by forces beyond your control. It really had felt like falling off a building at the time, like she had stepped off an edge without noticing and suddenly found herself speeding towards something she had never asked for. Not literally, of course. She had been rooted to the ground, unable to breathe, much less think about walking towards the man she'd accidentally locked eyes with. He seemed to be in much the same position. His drink even dropped out of his hand because he had apparently, like her, lost all motor functions. They stood there so long that people caught on to what had happened. And soon, they were in the center of a ring of tipsy partygoers congratulating the both of them on their luck. "His name is Mason!" someone from the crowd yelled to her, as someone else pushed the man, Mason, apparently, towards her. He seemed to gain a small semblance of himself back at the touch, and a smile split his face. Her heart had nearly stopped right there. His smile was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and she couldn't tear her eyes away. Normally, she wouldn't have looked twice at him, she was pretty sure. Not that he wasn't attractive, but the tall, dark, and handsome aesthetic had always set her on edge. "Hi," he forced out, eyes scanning over her like she was some precious treasure he had just found. And she couldn't help the thrill that ran through her at the idea. He was gorgeous, perfect, and looking at her like she was something special to him, like he was feeling the same way she was. There was something bothering at the back of her mind even as they began to dance, but she ignored it. Her head was spinning, her heart pounding. All she could think about was him, and it was wonderful. At least, it felt wonderful. She was so off balance she couldn't really tell if it was actually a great feeling or not. She just knew that he was the only thing that made her feel stable. So she ignored the niggling feeling while she learned more about the man she was destined to be with. Hours later, they exited the party, leaning on each other, not just because they were slightly tipsy, but because they both still felt the after effects of the fall. "When can we see each other again?" Mason asked, running a hand delicately down the side of her face. She leaned into the touch. Her head almost stopped spinning when he was cradling it. She must have said something, answered in some way, but she didn't remember. She only knew when he pecked her on the cheek and looked at her with a shy little smile. But then, he was gone. He was gone, and it felt like he had taken all of her organs with him. Everything but her heart, because she could swear the beating was now echoing around the empty cavern where her stomach used to be, fading to nothing in moments. Katie. A man's voice, one she recognized. It sent her whipping around, needing to see him, but nearly hoping she wouldn't. But she did. There he was, slight stature and light hair, looking at her with the most heartbreaking smile. Charles, she gasped out, and suddenly she could feel her insides again. They were back with a vengeance, punishing her for forgetting them with the most uncomfortable sensation of illness. Her vision blurred, suddenly tears were spilling from her eyes, and her knees gave out while an ugly sob tore itself from her throat. Katie, it's okay, please don't cry. Charles immediately rushed over, pulling her hair back as she began to retch and using his other hand to rub her back. Katie didn't much notice either action, or even the fact that her stomach had just relinquished its contents. Too distracted. Distracted by the sight of her hand, which had been brought into sight when she fell. Even though her vision was still blurred with tears, she could make out a glint on the fourth finger of her left hand. A ring. Custom made. The band was black ceramic with Hawaiian koa wood and blue opal inlaid. Charles had given it to her only a year previously. Charles, who she had come to this party with. Charles, whom she had completely ignored, whom she had forgotten about for the entirety of the night, and yet was here, holding her hair as she retched. Charles, who she was married to, who everyone knew she was married to, and yet they had congratulated her and encouraged her when she abandoned him for Mason. I'm so sorry. Kitty sobbed once she had run out of bile to throw up, falling back into Charles, who embraced her without hesitation. No, it's fine. It's not your fault. I'm happy for you. Happy. And maybe he was. But he was more hurt. She could see that clearly. And even if he was happy, she certainly wasn't. She could still feel it, the after effects of the fall. And even as she cursed herself for hurting Charles, Kitty couldn't stop herself from wondering where Mason was now. She had tried. Katie had tried so hard to cut ties with Mason and ignore that the fall had ever happened. Calling him to tell him all of the reasons they couldn't be together didn't work. As soon as she heard his voice, she lost track of what she was supposed to be doing and had spent nearly 2 hours just chatting. Texting worked better. She was able to inform him that she was married. He, too, was horrified. He hadn't known. She hadn't thought he did. He wasn't malicious, just affected by the fall like she had been. For about 2 days, that had been it. Except it hadn't. Not really. She didn't see Mason, and she didn't speak to him, but there was an emptiness in her days that hadn't been there before. And every time she noticed it, she couldn't help but think that being with Mason would fix it. And then they happened to be at the coffee shop at the same time. Both had randomly decided to try a new one this morning, and it just so happened to be the same one. As soon as she saw him, she fell all over again. They were both late to work that day, and the only reason they separated at all was because one of Katie's friends happened to see them and remind her that she had work to do. This time, the aftershocks of the fall weren't as bad. But that was probably because she wasn't yanked back to reality quite as jarringly. In fact, it took her 3 hours to really get into her work, and she continued to periodically zone out after that. It was only when one of her coworkers started shaking her, laughing loudly, that she seemed to really surface. Wow, Kate, you're smitten, the woman, Barbara, jested. All of the co-workers within earshot chuckled, and a few even shouted out congratulations. Congratulations. As if there was anything to be joyful about. Everyone seemed to forget that Katie was married, that she had a husband whom she loved. Apparently, that didn't matter. Apparently, what was condemned in usual circumstances as infidelity was celebrated when it happened between people who were so-called soulmates. Smitten was a word people had been throwing around her a lot, always like it was some sort of wonderful joke, like it was a beautiful thing to be smitten. Katie wasn't sure when people had started using smitten as a word for being in love, but she was sure it had to do with the fall. After all, smitten came from the Proto-Germanic word smetana, which meant to hurl or fling. That morphed into the Old English smitten, which meant to smear or blemish. For someone to be smitten, someone must smite them, and seeing a person that triggers the fall certainly feels like being hurled head first. And then what happens afterwards? Katie was a good person. She was faithful and loving to Charles. But ever since meeting Mason, everything had gone on its head. No longer was she trustworthy. Although Charles had never indicated that he thought so, she herself knew it was true. No longer could she even trust herself to walk down the street alone, for fear that she would run into Mason alone, and then... If she wasn't blemished because of this, if her reputation, her faith in herself, her trust in a loving deity had not been smeared because of this, well, she couldn't think of a word better than smitten to describe her. Charles had been helping her through the falls and aftershocks for nearly 6 months now. Katie and Mason tried so hard not to see one another, but somehow they always ended up in the same place, and when they did, all logic seemed to fly out the window. Other people who had found their soulmates said the more time spent with each other, the closer the two became, the less the fall would affect them. It would never go away completely, but after a certain level of emotional intimacy was reached, it would begin to decrease. Katie had no intention of ever getting that comfortable with Mason, because although the falling would lessen, it would complicate her relationship with Charles even more. Because then, it wouldn't be some biological mumbo-jumbo. There would be real feelings to deal with. The door opened without a sound, and Katie couldn't help but be just a bit disappointed. A huge creak would have been more apt for her current mood. She had just successfully avoided Mason for the first time, although ignoring the magnetic pull had the side effect of causing a pounding headache. She was still proud of herself, and she couldn't wait to tell Charles. "Kate, we need to talk." She stopped, head swinging up towards the voice in mild panic. Charles sounded sad. She winced at the fast movement, which aggravated her headache, but kept an eye on him anyway. "Are you okay?" he asked, leaping up from the chair he had been sitting in and rushing to her immediately. "I'm fine, fine," she tried to laugh, batting his hands away. "What do we need to talk about?" He stared at her in silence, taking in the sallow complexion and the bags that had been accumulating under her eyes. It had been getting worse and worse ever since that guy had shown up. Charles knew, logically, that it wasn't his fault, that it wasn't anyone's fault. It was hard not to blame him, though. Even though he wanted to blame Katie's soulmate, even thinking the word hurt, he knew that nothing would be fixed, leaving things as they were. And he had seen that other man getting worse as the months wore on as well. He didn't much care for the guy, but still. It was proof that he couldn't resolve this just as much as Katie couldn't. And if neither of them could, there was only one person left. "I'm leaving." Time seemed to stop for a moment, and the look in Katie's eyes nearly made him take it back immediately, but the rest of her appearance allowed him to hold his tongue. "What? Charles, I didn't..." Mason and I aren't, she rushed to explain, tripping over her words, but he quickly shushed her, placing gentle hands on her shoulders. No, Katie, I know you love me, and I know you would never cheat. She looked relieved, but then straightened up with fire in her eyes. He needed to explain before she could convince him out of this. But that's exactly why I'm leaving. You're miserable. I can see it. And you're doing it for my sake. I need you to be happy. And staying with me is just hurting you. But you'll never leave me. So I'm leaving. Go be with... Charles looked almost physically ill, but forced out. Him. Your soulmate. Please. Go be happy for both of us. Charlie, wait, don't... He was gone. It took Katie nearly an hour to move again, and when she did, she walked straight out the door. She couldn't be inside. Not in that house. Not with those memories. It didn't matter that it was raining, a nice little sprinkling that usually would send her running outside in a thrill. Now, she walked through it without a single solitary feeling, going nowhere. Or anywhere, really. Perhaps she could go to Charles' parents' house. They lived nearby, and were doubtless who he had gone to. It just all seemed so surreal, walking around in the rain, feeling numb inside and out. Is there a reason you're standing outside in the rain? Katie's first reaction was to turn and bolt from the voice, but she found herself stumbling towards it instead. Mason. She hadn't realized she'd stopped, had been staring at a house. His house. She'd been before, once. One time it almost went too far, but she had managed to tear herself from the fall and return home. Why had she come here? She hadn't even really consciously known where the place was before. Did he really have that much sway over her? Mason stood on his doorstep, looking at her soaked form expectantly, and she managed to stop herself a whole foot away from him, just staring right back. Well, did something happen? He asked, reaching out and cupping her cheek. She wanted to flinch away, but ended up leaning in instead. The headache was already receding just with that touch. He left me, Katie finally forced out, and in that moment, it all seemed real for the first time, and she collapsed into Mason's arms. She hated herself when, in the back of her mind, she noticed that Mason's embrace seemed to be more comforting than Charles had ever been. It took nearly an hour for her to calm down, and when she did, she pulled back. She didn't get far, though, both because she couldn't bring herself to move more than a few inches from him and because his arms still encircled her firmly. In fact, she pulled back just enough to look him in the face, and they stood there for a few minutes, just looking at each other, taking in every bit. Will you come in this time? Mason asked, eyes pleading. Katie hesitated, brain feeling cloudy. She wasn't sure this time if it was from emotional exhaustion or from the fall once again taking effect, but at this point, she wasn't sure if it mattered. Thinking about it, a few tears once again started to well up. She blinked them away and noticed that, although it certainly felt like she was being drawn towards him as usual, for the first time, she felt she could really speak. So she looked into his eyes, feeling the first of a fresh wave of tears fall down her cheek, and finally said the first thing she had thought when she saw him. The very first thing, which had been lost in the rush of the fall until she had time to reflect later, which had returned every time she had seen him afterwards, only to be swept away before she could even consider putting a voice to it. This time, she was determined. Do you know how much better off I would be if I had never met you. She shrugged his arms off her, ignoring the hurt on his face that made her feel like she had been stabbed in the gut. She would not change her stance. Wait. No. Please don't speak to me. I love someone else, and biology won't change that. She walked away from Mason, feeling like she was dragging a boulder that grew the further she got, but she refused to go back. Charlie was her husband. She fell in love with him, not Mason. She would get him back. She wouldn't see Mason again. Ever again. Even though the very thought of it sent her hyperventilating. It was a miracle that she made it home at all. But as soon as she did, she collapsed on her knees in front of the toilet and once again lost her food. Bacon and French toast, she knew. The last meal Charles had made her, in the toilet, just like their lives since Mason had appeared. And this time, there wasn't even anyone to hold her hair.
Oh, Cricket here with Judge's comments. Oh my gosh, I'm not prepared to talk about this piece. I've been putting off recording this for weeks. The thing is, usually when I go to record these Judge bits, I reread the Scorches beforehand. Not so for this week. I love this piece that Bones wrote so much. I have not reread it since the first week because it had such a strong impact on me. I think about it literally all the time, but I'm not strong enough to reread it because now I know what's coming. And I'm not prepared to experience those emotions again. I love like soulmate concepts and soulmate theories. I've read so many of them at this point. I've read a bunch that like, you know, really straightforward ones where it's just like, oh, these two people are soulmates happily ever after. And then I've read a lot that are like, explore the idea of like, what does it actually mean to have like a soulmate or like a link in this way? And what if those two people don't get along? Or what if they want to choose other people? Or like, I've read so many. This is one of the best ones I've ever seen that explores the idea of like, what if you have this kind of soulmate concept, but someone chooses something otherwise? And when I read it for the first time, it made me like physically nauseous. Like reading what the main character experienced and like the effects of the soulmate bond on her and what it felt like to go against that. It just impacted me so strongly. This is such a well done piece. This is one of the times I messed up our little cycle that we had because I picked Bones instead of Pacey, but it like I couldn't not choose this piece because it had such a strong impact on me. A strong enough impact that I think about it literally all the time 6 years later, and I've never reread it because I don't want to do that again. It's so good. It's so good. I'm really nervous to listen to this episode, actually, because I am going to listen to the episode. Gotta make the transcript, and then I listen to them when they publish, but like, I'm scared. I'm gonna actually have to experience this again. It's so good. I was so blown away by this piece. I was so blown away by this piece. Also, just for the record, I mean, this is maybe the first example of me giving like a sad hours prompt and then being like, I can't believe I got such sad pieces. Peishi wrote something that was really like tugged on the heartstrings as well. And then I was like, why am I so sad? Yeah, I gave a sad prompt. But I hope you really enjoyed this piece. And if you never hear from me again in the Cellblock Scorch, it's because having to listen to this piece on audio actually killed me. So there you go. Back to Bones.
Yeah, so in my defense, when Cricket was literally crying actual tears and asking why I did this to her, the answer is that she told me to. This is one of the 2 Scorches that I've written that have literally made my cohorts cry, and I'm very proud of that fact. Oh, and a random aside before I get into the topic of the Scorch, that whole linguistic nonsense in the middle, I don't know if I've mentioned before, but I'm a linguist. I love languages, but the funny thing about this is that it was written during my first year of college, back when I was a theater major. Who was I even kidding? I was always this nuts about words. Also, I included the picture of the ring Charlie gave Katie, so if you want to see it, you can go onto the Patreon and look at it for free in the week 12 folder. It's very pretty. Octo got me one that looks like it a while back because I legitimately think it's the best ring vibe ever. So I have it, and every time I look at it, I remember this Scorch. Even though I think about it all the time, this is standalone. I'm never writing more about it. I vaguely considered it once, but here's the thing. When people ask if there's more, what they want is what happens after, and how she gets Charlie back. But the one time I considered expanding this at all, I just can't imagine ending it any other way. If I were making it longer, I would literally just go way more in depth about all the times she runs into Mason and how much she hates herself in between those times for wanting to. And I would show Charlie trying to support her through it and him coming to the decision to leave her so that she wouldn't feel guilty about doing what the universe has decided is best for her. And maybe I would even have some Mason focused chapters as he tries to figure out what's going on. And after tens or hundreds of pages following these 2, 3 even, suffer, I would end it the exact same way I did here. Because to me, this is the perfect ending for this piece. Peishi and Cricket have both told me that this is a tragic ending, but I didn't write it to be tragic. Because to me, this is a hopeful ending. She overcame the nonsense magic that was ruining her life. It's still there, but she can fight it. She's strong. She's off to go find her husband, the one she chose. She's gonna get him back because he only left because he loves her. I also want to clarify that even though Mason is accidentally the antagonist here just by existing, he's not evil, you know? He's not meant to be seen as evil. He's tragic, just like the other two. We don't focus on him, but I specifically included that line about him being horrified that she's married. He's got some self-hate about ruining a marriage, but he also feels entitled to be the one she chooses in the end because they're soulmates. If we'd focused more on him and their interactions, we would have seen Mason trying to convince Katie of the importance of the soulmate bond and how she definitely loves Charlie, but soulmates are meant to be together. And this isn't meant to show him being awful. This is meant to show that Mason grew up on soulmate stories and believes them with his whole soul, and he doesn't understand why Katie doesn't think the same way. Mason is tragic because he believes in soulmates, and his doesn't want him because she already found someone else. Anyway, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. So there's a reason I wrote this the way I did, and it's actually because of the tropes commonly associated with soulmate AUs in fanfiction. And in original fiction, I'm guessing, but I don't read original stories that have soulmates, so I wouldn't know. The thing is that they can be really cute, and usually they're meant to be, you know, but I have serious issues with some of the tropes, and namely, it's the ones that use the soulmate mechanic to force two people who actually hate each other to fall in love, not to talk and eventually realize that they have a lot in common and get over their differences, etc. But the badly written ones, where it's presented as a foregone conclusion that these two will end up together even if they hate each other. Any previous romantic interest, even if they're literally married, is treated as lesser and ignored. And even if they don't hate each other. In this, Katie specifically notes that people who look like Mason, the tall, dark, and handsome trope, make her uncomfortable. She generally likes people like Charlie, smaller, bookish, mousy little men who are just so sweet. This, of course, isn't to say she couldn't ever love someone like Mason, but it's just supposed to be another way that the soulmate dynamic forces things instead of helping them progress naturally, making it so the decisions and desires of some strange mechanic is treated as more important than feelings, than preferences, than existing commitments, than anything. And I hate it. So I wrote a world that made other people feel like I do about it, making the soulmate dynamic deliberately, explicitly coercive, taking away the person's free will and ability to choose. And then, instead of following through, I did what I always wish writers would do. Look, nothing is better to me than a soulmate AU where the soulmates don't end up together because one of them is a jerkwad who doesn't deserve the darling they're destined to be with, and the darling finds someone better or has had someone the whole time. Or, even as in this, maybe the soulmate isn't terrible, but he's not who the main character chose. And that should mean something. But people don't write that, because that's not why people write soulmate AUs. They write them for the couple they've magicked to be together despite all odds and obstacles, including them being an objectively terrible couple. So, I wrote a soulmate AU that hopefully made people feel like I do about that concept. I hope you were all disturbed and angry at what was happening to my lady Katie, distressed for Charlie and mad at the other guy's existence, and also maybe a bit guilty about it because it's really not his fault. Like, the poor guy. But he's not in my OTP, so oh well. So yeah, feel free to tell me how horrible I am in the comments. This piece often gets that reaction. Also, you can select multiple answers on the Spotify poll this week, so keep that in mind. In the meantime, I'll tell you that the next prompt for week 13, I prompted the quote, "He's a human being, just like the rest of us." And then a second quote that's just an ellipsis. Clearly, with the intention that whoever is being referred to by the first is not, in fact, a human being. This is a humorous exchange that happens in one of my pieces in the Maestroverse, where one of the heroes is mad about how Zachem, the clone, is being treated, and Zachem is, a clone and not quite a human being just like the rest of them. So yeah, thanks for listening. Tell me all the horrible things you think about me now. And feel free to check out our Patreon. It's got Peishi's piece up there from this week so that you can read it and be mad with Peishi that I won instead of her. Ha 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 ha. But anyway, thanks for listening and keep those fires burning. The Cellblock Scorch is a production of Stellacore, an independent group of nerds sharing their obsessions with the world. We can be reached at thestellacore@gmail.com through comments on your podcast platform of choice, our Instagram, Stella_core, and at our YouTube, also called Stellacore. Feel free to check out our other productions on our YouTube channel or our cosplays on Instagram. If you would like to support our creative endeavors, you can give a one-time tip to the Ko-Fi of the writer of your favorite Scorches, or check out our Patreon, linked in the show notes. There, you can access the winning Scorches and episode transcripts for free, or sign up for Spark level support for $5 a month to gain access to all of the Scorch submissions.